Hello, everybody, and welcome to SBI's Reigniting Small Business Podcast. I am Patrick Lee, and I'm here with my usual cohort in crime, Laura Richards. And today's topic is an offshoot of a lot of what we've been talking about and what's happening out in the world. The idea that a lot of business has had to go remote, that workforce is at home, working from home offices, they're spread out. And I think one of the interesting sort of things that's happened because of that is that even with employees not in the office or in the brick and mortar, that there's still a massive effort on the part of many owners and managers to micromanage remotely. And I think that that's intriguing. I know that you had seen an article that was about Siemens, I think it's a German company, and what they talked about around their remote workforce. So what are you seeing and what were your thoughts?
Well, I just think it's really interesting that on top of everything else, we're now thinking about what kind of management style we need to use because of the pandemic. But different work styles require different types of management styles. So if you're working remotely versus in the office, and more and more people are working towards that, as you mentioned. So Siemens has 380,000 employees, and they're spread all over the world. And they've decided that their distributed workforce is going to remain remote for the long haul. They're not going to go back to brick and mortar. And what's interesting about that to me is that their metrics of performance, they're judging this based on output, and based on output, they are more successful with this business strategy than they were basically measuring face time, which is what they were doing before. And
the interesting thing there is obviously they discovered that it's probably more profitable. It's probably less stressful. Employees have better morale. So there's a benefit coming out of what they're doing there. For a smaller business, right, where like production isn't based on 380,000 employees, it's based on 5, right? Yeah. Or maybe 25. I think there's probably more of a temptation to make sure that production is coming out of them. And I think that there's two different things that can happen. One is that we either continue or start to micromanage from afar. And the other is that we realize that we don't really have that much control over those employees, and we start to let them do what they need to do. What's your thoughts on what's the proper way to stay in contact with your employees, manage them in this sort of remote setting, and still get output from them?
Well, I have to look at the stories that I'm being told as indicators of what's working and not working. And folks that are being micromanaged feel pretty resentful. They don't necessarily feel valued for their creative solutions or for their ability to problem solve and think. They kind of feel like they can't be trusted and they have to prove themselves, which seems to zap a lot of their motivation. And I'll give you 2 examples that I've heard just in the last week. The first example is a girlfriend of mine that works at a community college and does stuff in the registrar's office. And all of her work was on a computer before, but typically with people standing in front of her. And what she's found out after doing this for years and years and years is that people can solve their own problems if they're given a couple hours to do it. And however, because her management wants to make sure that she's being productive, they have now a rule about responding to emails like within 10 minutes. And so none of those problem solving opportunities are there anymore because she's no longer able to make the call. Oh, I imagine that student's going to figure that out if they keep tinkering with it. I'm going to try them in an hour. She can no longer make that call. And that's frustrating because she's doing quite a bit more work than she was doing before. And there are problems that the students would easily solve themselves. Second scenario, what someone else was telling me that one of their friends in a work environment is being monitored on their mouse strokes. So if the mouse is inactive for a certain period of time, it sends an alert and they get busted for basically not being on their computer. So I don't think it takes a genius to understand why that would be bad for morale and probably bad for output in general and dampen creativity and motivation.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think there's two reasons that you might micromanage in this situation. The first reason is that you've always micromanaged, right? And you're going to continue to micromanage. That's your management style. But the second one I think is a little bit more related to what's happening now. You're used to managing, folks that are sitting in front of you that are you can touch when you need to touch. You can see where you need to see. So your comfort is there to maybe not micromanage. But now that they're out of your sight and you can't sort of feel what's going on, and you're trying to manage from a home office and you're feeling disoriented, you begin to micromanage because that's how you're trying to get control of the situation. I mean, I think they're two very different things. Let's talk about the one that just is new to micromanaging. It sounds like actually that would be your registrar office, right? Like they weren't doing this before. Now they feel a need to do it. Why are they feeling that need? And what should they maybe be considering instead?
So, like I said, I think if you think about what a registrar's office looks like, it's a fishbowl, right? You've got glass, you have ropes, and everybody's lined up around the ropes. It's very easy to see people in the fishbowl being productive. So I think if you take a manager out of a fishbowl, it's almost like, oh my gosh, my job is to see people and to see how they're interacting and what they're doing. So it's really like they're trying to still keep all of their hands on that action to see what's going on, but they're unable to do that. So I think it's a lot of letting go and finding the output to be measured. So if we had 20 clients touch bases today, how many issues were resolved and how did that compare to our old scenario? You kind of have to develop new metrics because this is all new. But I think it's really important. And I think that those non-essential work touch points are also important because if you're going to be asking your staff for things professionally, you also want to let them know, hey, I know you're a human being and you're dealing with the pandemic just like I am, or your family issues, or your sick pet. I'm still here for you even though you can't see me.
All right, so we're looking at this from the manager trying to make sure that they're doing their job. Let's back up a second because you said something earlier that I thought was very interesting, which was that we're measuring not on face time, we're measuring on productive output. So is this one of those moments where we can learn sort of quickly that an 8-hour workday is not really an 8-hour workday? In fact, there's all kinds of studies out there showing that most employees work somewhere between actually 2 and 4 hours in an 8-hour day where they're productive or maximum productive. So it's do we need to be doing that? Do we need to be watching people and keeping them on a clock, or should we be switching whether we're remote or not remote to these new metrics of output like Siemens is basically doing?
And it's not just Siemens, Patrick. I was reading Twitter's already announced they will never be back in offices. They won't be doing brick and mortar. 100% of their employees will be remote. Facebook has said in 10 years they will be 100% remote. They'll be increasing the percentage that they have remote between now and then. And there are going to be a lot more. I mean, obviously, there's some businesses that will always have that brick and mortar component. But I think what people are finding is with the right model, they can be successful with remote workers.
And so let's go to the manager's nightmare, because that's really where this all comes down to, right? It comes down to, well, I know those people will probably do that, and this person's always doing that, but those three, if I'm not on them, they're not going to do anything, right? So what are we saying to them?
Well, me as an employer would say, I don't think they were doing anything for you before.
You have the wrong employees.
And you shouldn't manage to those employees, right? You want to create your management style for your stars and then get more stars.
So then let's talk about this, because the group we sort of just ignored that I threw out there before is the folks who've been micromanaging all along, and they're simply extending that micromanagement into the new reality. So first of all, let's talk about the benefits of not micromanaging, of how you manage an employee to good production without having to have your thumb on them the whole time.
Well, Patrick, I'm glad you asked me that, because there is a pretty hefty list here. We've talked already a little bit about it, but you have to trust employees. They feel that, and when they feel trusted, it empowers them to come up with creative solutions and to be a bigger asset to the company. So that's a big one right there. We talked a little bit about demonstrated caring. Obviously we don't want this to be something that's contrived. It should be authentic to the relationship that you already have with the employee. Or if it's a new employee, then it's a way of engaging with the employee that you're going to replicate for, all of your staff. Knowing somebody's connected to you and concerned about you obviously makes you want to perform for them. And I think it's always important when you're doing remote projects to make sure you're clearly communicating. What are the expectations? Give it to people in writing. If it's response times that you're measuring, what are those? What are the deadlines? What are the project touch points? And what meetings do they need to be prepared for? If you're doing project work, what are the milestones in the project? So really creating good communication around the work itself is important, and measuring those milestones, and obviously measuring outputs so that you can give those attagirls and attaboys to people for a job well done, because recognition is really important, and especially when people are not right in front of you to get the daily pat on the back. When they complete something and do a good job, you want to make sure you're acknowledging that. Also, tuning in for some good listening. We have all had our fill of Zoom calls, and it's really easy to zone out. But to demonstrate to people that you hear their ideas, if they're offering an opinion, acknowledge the opinion. I hear you. That's a good opinion. Or constructive criticism. If you're giving feedback, make sure you give it constructively, both for things they're doing well, and then also for things that they can improve on. And lastly, when you do all of the above, you get to reap the benefits of the trusting relationship. And some of those are, Patrick, what we had already talked about. Your company will be seen as a flexible employer, and people will want to work for you. There'll be good word of mouth, probably referrals from the employees themselves as well. And you may be surprised, like Siemens, and actually improve your performance capability, and by focusing on output versus face time.
So, so the next thing that sort of that jumps out at me is we're talking as if we've got one manager or one owner and everybody, but there are organizations, even small businesses, where there's levels of management,
Sure.
right? So how do the managers remotely manage the supervisors, and then how do the supervisors stay in communication to manage each of their teams? How do we build in this layered effect that is probably obvious when you're sitting with all the folks, you can see the teams, where the offices are. How do we make that work?
Well, I think you kind of have to replicate the systems that work for you when you're in a face-to-face environment, but you modify them. So, for example, I'll look at our situation when you and I were in a physical office environment. Once a week I would come and plop myself down in the conference room and just do a brain dump. This is everything I have going on, and what do you have going on? And then you'd brain dump, and then we'd hash it out. And we still do that every Monday morning on Zoom. So, and we have more frequent touch points. So instead of talking to each other twice a week for a longer period of time, we may talk to each other 4 times a week and maybe have a couple of podcasts, for a little bit shorter period of time. But I think the main thing is recognizing that structure is needed, and that it comes in different forms, and that it may come in different forms for different people. You may have a manager that really does well on the phone. You may have someone that does much better with visuals. So figuring out which technology aids you need for your managers, and having that conversation with them. How do you want our management sessions to go? And creating those touch points and team touch points is important. And one thing that we haven't really touched on, but I also think is important, is social time. Just because we're all in quarantine, you still have to have those quarterly meetings or those fun outings with the sales team, or those things that keep people fired up. So finding creative ways to play online bingo and award prizes. Seriously, there's things out there that you can do with your teams. And I think it's really important for not just morale, but for team building and incentivizing people to still feel a part of something, that we do those fun activities as well.
I also think it's important to know that whenever a routine is broken up and people are sort of unmoored because this isn't our routine, well, how is it supposed to work? Adhering, you set up your systems, but then adhere to them. So don't like, well, that didn't really work, so forget it. Well, of course it didn't work. You've not ever done it before. It's your first time or second time. You can adapt, but don't say, well, nobody had anything to say, so I'm not holding those meetings anymore, right? Because 1 week later, they may have a lot to say, but there's no place to say it. So I think that whole idea of setting a new routine, giving it some time, and then seeing what happens and adjusting is better than sort of freaking out because, oh, nothing's working right now. I need to blow it all up again or do nothing.
Patrick, that's a great point. And to that point, I think the same thing when you first start measuring output. This is something that's going to be a little bit new process for everybody. So you can't measure after the first 2 hours and go, it's not working, I'm going back to micromanaging, or even the first day or first week. I think you need to put expectations in place and allow the staff to build to them and, monitor it, certainly monitor it, but.
And I think there's another piece to this too, because this is an opportunity to find out who your stars are. I mean, when you have a team of employees all working, you may feel like, okay, well, that person produces and that person doesn't as much, but the team is sort of covering in all areas. This gives you an opportunity to actually measure very specifically output from employees. Who are your stars? Does somebody surprise you? Is somebody not as productive as you thought they were? What does that look like? I think there's ways to build this to get new metrics that tell you what you have. What is your team capable of?
Absolutely. I agree 100%. I think really the bottom line, if you're motivating your employees, you're staying connected to them, you're going to have a pretty good handle on whether it's working or not working. And you may experience what Siemens did, which is overall improved output.
So I think our message here is beware of the micromanaging, motivate and trust your employees. Do you have anything to add to that, Laura?
No, I think take stock and be honest with yourself. And if you are among the micromanagers, you're not alone. Don't beat yourself up, but reach out for that management toolkit, because these aren't new management practices. These are just the same good management practices applied in a new environment, and you can do it.
Well said. Thank you all for joining us here today on the Reigniting Small Business podcast. We hope to see you again next week. Actually, Laura's going on vacation next week, so you will either see me and a guest, or maybe just me, or maybe nobody. But we do hope you'll continue to watch our podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.